Can Rishi Sunak stop Tory infighting? Do voters know what Keir Starmer stands for? And is social media driving a wedge within families? On the panel today, Conservative MP Danny Kruger, Labour peer Baroness Chakrabarti, author and broadcaster Alistair Campbell and the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Today, Rishi Sunak comes under pressure as his Home Secretary addresses the Tory right. So can the party avoid a split?
I don't have to agree with everything that everybody says to welcome the very fundamental fact that we're still the party coming up with new ideas.
Keir Starmer says he'll be more radical than Blair.
This project goes further and deeper than New Labour's rewriting of Clause 4. It is, if you like, Clause 4 on steroids.
But he's warned by Corbyn allies not to alienate left-wing voters.
Sit down, sweetheart, sit down. Where's my phone?
And Kate Winslet makes an impassioned plea at the BAFTAs about the dangers of social media. We lost Kate Winslet there, but we will play her again towards the end of the programme. Welcome to Politics Live. Let's start with Ukraine's President Zelensky and his surprise visit to the UK for talks with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. They were greeted each other, I should say, at Chequers. Warm personal relationship you can see there, very much in evidence, but it didn't take long for President Zelensky to cut to the chase and the meat of the negotiations. Let's have a listen.
Spoke about the jets, very important topic for us because we can't control the sky, you know it.
It is not a straightforward thing, as Vladimir and I have been discussing, to build up that fighter combat aircraft capability. It's not just the provision of planes, it's also the training of pilots and all the logistics to go alongside that.
It's very clear what President Zelensky wants. There is more military support from the UK and other European governments, but it's the fighter jets that he wants, which so far the UK, alongside allies such as the US, have refused to send. Is it time, Danny, to give Ukraine what it needs to get the job done?
Well, we're doing what we can within the restraints of our own capabilities, but also, as the Prime Minister just said there, in terms of the time frame that it takes to build up capacity in Ukraine. I'll leave the PM to discuss exactly what munitions we should be providing. I would support the appeal that the Ukrainian president is making, but we have to come up with our own response to it. My wish is that we ensure that the UK armed forces are properly resourced, and the government has put significant additional money in. But the main thing is that we backfill anything that we give to Ukraine and ensure that we grow our own armed forces to face the challenges of this time.
But that's not exactly what Zelensky is saying. If this war is going to continue, he needs more military hardware, a more coordinated response, including from the UK, to actually finish it.
Well, that's right, and that's why we will continue to give them what they need. We
But
have
not
committed
fighter
already.
jet.
Well, we've already committed £2 billion worth of support just this year alone, and we're providing, a lot of missiles, a lot of other hardware. So I'm sure the Prime Minister will be discussing that properly. And as I say, it's not a simple thing just to send planes. They have to be properly trained as well, the pilots.
Does this risk antagonising Putin ever further? Is there a risk associated with upping the military support to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, we're reading about the positions of different NATO leaders with the Vilnius summit coming, and we're reading about the implications for the US election. I think, of course, you have to support Ukraine because this is a war of aggression by Russia, but at the same time, there will have to be negotiations at some point. This war is not going to end with conquest. It's going to end with some kind of negotiation, hopefully from strength. But if Donald Trump is re-elected, which would be a cataclysmic event, in my view, for the world, he's already indicating that he is he's quite well disposed to ending this war on Putin's terms. So I think it's very important for President Biden to signal that he's going to up the game on diplomacy and hopefully end this war before the presidential election.
What do you think the government should do? There are limitations in terms of fighter jets. We heard from Danny and from Rishi Sunak in terms of what can be supplied right now. But there was criticism already this morning from Tobias Ellwood, who is the Conservative MP and chair of the Defence Select Committee, saying that NATO has sat on its hands when it comes to a coordinated response. Should we give Ukraine everything it wants to get this job done?
I think it's unfair to say NATO sat on its hands. NATO is a collection of alliances. It's an alliance. It's a collection of governments. They don't all have these identical views. You look at Erdogan, who's trying to get re-elected now. He's made his whole election about saying, I'm not Biden's poodle, as it were. Look, America is the lead in this, and I think America's commitment is pretty strong. I completely agree with Shami that Putin is desperate for Biden to lose to Trump, and that would be a massive thing. But what I think Zelensky is doing incredibly cleverly, he's an absolutely brilliant strategist and communicator. He has done an amazing job in keeping the European Union pretty bound into him, keeping the UK very, very supportive. And this last couple of days where he's been to Italy, to Germany, to France, now to the UK, he always does this. He asks for a little bit more than he thinks he's going to get, and then he gets a little bit less, and he's actually pretty happy. And I think actually the mood music I read out of that is that the UK is going to keep on supporting him, but with this caveat that the Americans and everybody else don't want to give Putin the opportunity to say this is now an all-out NATO attack on Russia. And I think he's gone so far down the track on this. But the truth is, the West has got to win this. I agree that it may not end in conquest in the way that Shami said, but the West has to win this. The NATO alliance has to win this, and that means we have to do what it takes to do that.
Henry?
Fundamentally, the British armed forces have to maintain sovereign capacity, and it's a blunt fact that the UK is not good at defence contracts. Defence procurement is a weakness. These things are expensive. They're very difficult to replace. So if we give Zelensky some of this equipment now, that's not only technically complex in terms of staff, spare parts, repairs, but it also means that it could punch a hole in Britain's capacity to act that we would take decades to fill. So we have to maintain the capacity of the British armed forces to act and then help Zelensky. He obviously has different priorities, but they can't be the British government.
All right, well, this visit, of course, will be followed throughout the day on the BBC News website. Let's just show you this headline in The Guardian. Tory anarchy breaks out as revolt looms on Brexit laws. This is actually referring to EU laws that Rishi Sunak promised to get rid of, and there was a row about it last week. Underneath it says, ex-ministers attack Rishi Sunak's leadership as pro-Johnson wing calls for lower taxes. This is the grassroots group called the Conservative Democratic Organisation. They held a conference at the weekend with various topics under discussion. I mean, Henry, what's interesting is there seems to have been a delayed reaction to the local election results last week, which were really bad for the Conservatives. Obviously, there was the coronation. How serious is this in terms of Conservative jitters or even talks of splits?
Well, I mean, the party never really splits, right? There's no viable challenger. Maybe if Nigel Farage was still in active politics, there might be something that people would defect to, but realistically, without him, no, the Tory party, this will be an internal bit of chaos. And the grassroots are angry, and the local election results were incredibly bad. And there's lots of things for pretty much every wing of the party to be disenchanted about. I think what's working in Rishi's favour is that there is currently no locus for discontent. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, they sort of went over the top a little while ago, and that was a bit of a damp squib. And so currently there's no obvious place for the rebels to rally around. But frankly, rallying around, like Boris Johnson supporters, rallying around the retained EU law bill, he was Prime Minister for 3 years. He had an overall majority for 2.5. He didn't get round to tabling a retained EU law bill. He had to leave that to Liz Truss. So the idea that Boris Johnson supporters are having a go at Rishi Sunak over this is just slightly weird. I
mean, there is a fracturing in support in areas that heavily voted to leave the EU in those local elections. You can think of Stoke-on-Trent or the Middlesbrough Mayor going from Independent to Labour, and even in Swindon. What lessons have you taken away from those results?
Well, the fact is we do need to deliver for those voters. We were elected in 2019 to oversee a grand transformation of the country, including getting out of the EU, but also delivering levelling up and rebalancing the economy in favour of those places left behind by Labour for so long. People turned to us because they thought we promised change.
And now you haven't
delivered.
Well,
I think after years of COVID, all the turmoils of our leadership, we have no one to blame but ourselves for that. It is understandable that many people in those places are thinking, that the Conservatives haven't delivered for them. We still need to, and I think Henry's analysis is right. Rishi's the man to do it. He can pull together both the traditional base, the sort of place that I represent in Wiltshire, as well as appealing to those Brexit
But those
voting.
local election results didn't seem to demonstrate that, did it, Danny?
But he's new, and they wanted to give us a kicking. And I think, in a sense, we deserve the kicking because we've been in political chaos, and because of the long delay over COVID meant that we haven't achieved the transformation that people promised. But what we need to do now, and you asked me what the lesson is, we need to lean into that realignment of politics that happened in 2019. We have to appeal directly to those voters, those socially conservative, culturally conservative voters, as well as to those traditional Tory supporters in the South. And the great trick of Conservatism over the years is it manages to hold quite a disparate coalition of supporters together, and we need to do that again in the next election.
And yet what you did before the 2019 election was purge a great deal of talent, and you purged liberal Tories, which I thought was actually quite unconservative. And when you talk about cultural conservatism, what you're talking about is culture wars and all this anti-woke nonsense that we hear from Suella Braverman, who I think has got a star turn later today. I think perhaps people are more concerned about paying their bills, meeting their mortgages, paying their rent. These are not even unemployed people. These are working nurses and so on. And I think maybe this advice that someone's been giving the Prime Minister to concentrate on stop the boats and bash trans people and all of these culture war issues is not the best advice for any mainstream party that wants to win the next general election.
These things matter significantly. You're right that the cost of living and the bread and butter issues matter the most to most people, but they also care about our borders, the security of our borders, and the asylum system being abused, and they care about the extraordinary, you talk about culture wars, the culture war has been brought to us by a strange transgressive ideology on the left of politics, which has infected our culture, and we need to push back against that sensibly and courteously, but deliberately. So it is culture and the economy are all wrapped up together in these voters who backed us last time because they want change and they want to get their country back.
Well, just to go back to that issue that you've talked about, a strange culture, you said, sort of developed by the left, I suppose, by Jeremy Corbyn. Do you accept that, of course, Jeremy Corbyn's offer was roundly defeated in 2019?
But I'm not even talking about Jeremy Corbyn. I'm talking about some of the things, actually, that Alistair talks about in his new book.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the fact that the rule of law and fundamental rights and freedoms and democracy is under threat all over the world. And we've had successive Conservative senior ministers joining in that populist far-right chant.
Right, and talking about Suella Braverman, I presume, when you're talking about populist...
I'm not just picking on her. But all this talk about... I mean, frankly, the Prime Minister does it when he's accusing people of being lefty lawyers. What? Because they don't represent the wealthy. They represent the vulnerable on legal aid when they need legal advice to keep their homes.
The British people voted for change, Shami, in 2019, overwhelmingly because they felt that there was an establishment based in London, well represented in the legal class, but also in the media and in politics, who didn't share their values and their interests. They wanted change, and they wanted politics to represent their values and their interests, and that's what we need to do.
I understand. Another thing that Alistair acknowledges in his... I haven't read the whole thing yet, but there's a lot in there, even at the beginning. One of the many reasons why people voted for Brexit and then in the post-Brexit elections, they wanted to take back control. And taking back control is for Parliament, not for the executive. And I think one of the problems I have with this EU retained law bill is that it's an executive power grab to number 10 and taking power away from Parliament, which is, I think, where people would have expected it to go.
I'm going to come to you, Alistair, in a moment, because we've mentioned your book, What Can I Do? But you do talk in the early parts of the book about populism, as you say, and the threat of populist governments. Suella Braverman's been mentioned, the Home Secretary. She is talking at a different conference later today, this afternoon. And she is talking about saying it's not xenophobic to call for curbs on mass migration. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's not, in theory. I think what it is just fairly useless, right? Because the Home Office is generally, in the past few years, where the Conservative government just puts the authoritarian. And its performance has not been very good. And I think what we miss from Suella Braverman or any other Conservative minister is, if you want to bring down headline migration figures, that's a perfectly fine objective. But there's no analysis of why we have it. And the reason that the government has consistently failed to bring headline immigration figures down is because the economy needs them. We need them to pay for social care. We need them to fill skills shortages. Now, in the medium to long term, you could try and change that. You could try and encourage more domestic training and so on. But they're not doing that. And if you look at how the government is actually using the points-based immigration system, which is a much better metric for how it treats immigration than what Suella Braverman says, they keep making new things, shortage occupations, they keep getting rid of barriers, they're making it easier.
Right. I mean, in terms of what Danny's been saying, Alistair, do you accept that a lot of people in 2019 in those areas that used to vote Labour and have come back a little bit in those local elections did so because of cultural conservatism? They liked what they heard from Boris Johnson and the failures of Jeremy Corbyn.
There's some of that, but I think you've got to wind back a bit. I actually think that... So Danny says that the Labour government left these communities behind. I think we did an awful lot for those communities. Then along comes Brexit. And the reason why a lot of people voted Brexit in these areas is because they were given this promise of Brexit delivering the change that they wanted. And I think a lot of the Conservatives' problems now is the fact that that has not happened. So what Suella Braverman is doing today, what Rishi Sunak was doing in Northern Ireland, they're trying to fix the things that have gone wrong as a consequence of the Brexit that they told was going to make told people was going to make their lives better. And I just think that your question at the top of the programme, can Rishi Sunak unite the Conservative Party? I'm afraid I think they've just become a sort of factionalised rabble. And I honestly do believe... So here's Danny today, he's launching New Conservatives, which I see has now been registered at Companies House with him and New National Conservatives with Danny and Miriam Cates, the two sole directors. You've got the ERG imploding because most of their leaders have decided to take the ministerial limo. You've got the Common Sense lot. And they just all... So they say that they're supportive of Rishi Sunak, but you know full well, Danny, that what Suella Braverman says this afternoon is going to be taken as a whack at Rishi Sunak. Yeah. Jacob Rees-Mogg is out this morning saying all sorts of things. He's actually saying the voter ID registration thing is a form of gerrymandering by your government. I just think the public are looking at this and they're thinking, this is a rabble. And they cannot get their act together.
Well, it does look like that, doesn't it?
Well, we're having a debate post, really bad local election results about the future of the party, and we are undergoing a transformation in the politics of the West, which is why there's so much turmoil around the world. When we have not been spared that. And the Conservative Party, which has historically been about maintaining stability and bringing together this coalition of voters, a one-nation party, is undergoing its own conversation now. It's not a rabble. It's actually a pretty courteous debate going on at the conference I was at today, in which Suella Braverman is articulating a very legitimate case. We have seen migration rise in this country. 8 million people added.
Under Conservatives,
yes,
net migration are record figures, 540,000.
Indeed.
Since taking back
control. If we go back to 2004, Alistair, when the government that you worked for opened the borders to Eastern Europe, we've had 8 million people added to the population.
Well, let's stick to sort of relatively recent history.
Yes, but that is what people are objecting to, and it is fair to say that people are saying, why haven't you brought migration down since Brexit? That's a legitimate question, and that is what we need to absolutely focus on now.
Businesses are also objecting to labour shortages. People going for a GP and nurses going to a hospital appointment are objecting to staff shortages.
But
the answer to that is not
debate and don't punish the most desperate refugees and walk out.
No, we want to be helping on the most desperate refugees, not these people who pay these people smugglers, Shamik.
And walk out of the refugee convention that Winston Churchill, your greatest leader, did so much to negotiate.
Can I talk about some of the things that you are going to discuss this afternoon? Because you say, how can Rishi Sunak deliver for the realignment in politics? The answer can be found in the transformation underway in conservatism across the world. This is your article in the New Statesman. And in particular, in the runaway success of Ron DeSantis in Florida and perhaps more controversially, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. These are very un-British characters and they give centrists the heebie-jeebies, but their success is worth studying closely. Why?
Because they have articulated the very appropriate desire among a public for a government that represents their values and their interests, and they're standing up against all sorts of transgressive behaviour both in the state and in the corporate sector, and they are speaking for their people. I don't think we should import their politics, by the way, genuinely. They're far too strong meat for the UK. We have a much more civil conservative tradition
than those countries. You're very fond of Orban.
Likewise, Orban, far too much for the UK. But again, he speaks for his people.
They are the transgressives.
The point about national conservatism is that every country has its own traditions, and there is no disgrace in people speaking for those and in seeking to have a politics that represents the values and interests of the majority of the people of their country. The problem we've been encountering for many years, and the Blair government really set it off in this country, is a commitment to the whole wider world and to these abstractions of humanitarian commitments, when actually what people want is for their own citizens to be served by their government. And that's the basis on which we can be generous to the refugees of the world, which we obviously need to.
I mean, democracy has delivered the sorts of people that you object to, people like Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban in Hungary and Trump in America. But you accept that was done democratically.
They won elections, but one of thanks to Shami for mentioning my book, one of the points I make is that this thing about 3P autocrats, populism, polarisation and post-truth, they win elections on one basis and then they govern on another. Donald Trump is a profoundly anti-democratic political figure. He's a fascist.
Yes.
Vladimir Putin won power on relatively democratic means, and look what he's created. And I think, look at Erdogan now. If Erdogan wins this election, which it looks like he's going to, 20 years in power, he's going to become more authoritarian. So I'm not saying we're as bad as that. I think we're on that. I think we're on that journey unless we get off it pretty quickly.
Well, Henry, do you think that?
No,
on that journey, on that trajectory?
No, fundamentally, it doesn't flatter anyone to think that they live in a relatively safe and trivial age, right? Like, all of this stuff about Britain turning into fascism is sort of a journalistic... No, you said all of the words, and then you said, but of course I don't think that, and then you said, but we're on that trajectory. So that's kind of like a sandwich with a denial in the middle.
I think Suella Braverman, as Home Secretary, is on that path. I really do.
No, but you look at what the Home Office is actually doing. Look at the actual policies it's carrying out. Like, no, it's literally
look at the
just
actual
words.
legislation.
This is all basically just, the childhood game, The Floor is Lava, when you want to liven up navigating an essentially safe environment by pretending that there's lots of dangers around. That's what this is.
Passing week on week.
Which legislation are you talking about?
I'm talking about the Public Order Act. I'm talking about the Illegal Migration Act, which is a coach and horses through the Refugee
The Public Order Act. The Public Order Act is a perfectly defensible piece of legislation. There are problems with the implementation by the police, but those are operational.
There was one protection. There were lots of new powers and offences, and there was one protection, Section 17, to protect journalists from being arrested on protests, and that was the provision they did not bring into force. The Home Office did not bring into force before the coronation. One of your colleagues got detained for 18 hours in our wonderful free society that is Britain.
Look, I'm
That's unconservative.
I'm sorry. That was bad, and that should not have happened, and the police can over. But we do fundamentally live in a free society. The fact that one journalist got locked up for 18 hours does not make this Russia. It does not make this Turkey. It does not make this Donald Trump.
You're not looking at the statute book.
You guys really want to strike bold poses against the ghosts of World War II.
Day in, day out.
Like every generation of leftists since that war.
Forgive me, Harry, we've not met before. Henry. We look at this legislation in the old folks' home that is the House of Lords week in, week out, and we look at parliamentary democracy being compromised by executive overreach. That is not in the best liberal traditions of this country, and it's not conservative or liberal.
Well, Danny, let Danny respond, and then we'll move on.
Well, on a whole range of issues, we are responding to new challenges. The Refugee Convention was written in an age when you did not have hundreds of millions of people on the move around the world. It was not written in an age when you could fly to the UK so easily. We really need to update our laws. The Public Order Act, I recognise there is genuine challenges about the implementation of that, but we're trying to deal with protests who are using different techniques, different methods to disrupt people going about their perfectly lawful business. I don't think you should be on the side of those protesters. You should be on the side of the public who want to get to work.
All right, well, we're talking about the government. Let's talk about Labour, the Labour Party, because Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was speaking at a conference himself at the weekend. Let's take a listen.
This project goes further and deeper than New Labour's rewriting of Clause 4. This is about rolling up our sleeves, changing our entire culture. It's our DNA. This task is going to be ongoing, difficult, and enormous. It is, if you like, Clause 4 on steroids.
What's he talking about exactly, Alistair, for you? I mean, what did you make of that?
Well, I'm one of those old-fashioned people who I read speeches, and I really enjoy reading speeches. And I actually thought this was actually a much more interesting speech than people have given it credit for, because I think what he was doing was setting out. He's not doing the detailed policy at this stage. It's not full of that. But he's essentially giving himself the challenge for what he has to do now between now and the next general election. And he's doing something pretty remarkable. I think he's described himself these three stages of the leadership so far. Decontaminate the Labour brand. It was hammered in 2019. That had to be changed. Show it's a new party, a changed party. Second, show that the Tories are absolutely hopeless, which I think they are, and I think most of the country sees that now. And then, thirdly, the Labour agenda. And I think what he's doing is actually signalling to the party that on the policy agenda, they have to be in a pretty bold space. I also thought, just going back to our previous discussion, the most interesting part of the speech to me was where he said the Conservatives are no longer a Conservative party because they're wrecking so much, whether it's the BBC, the National Health Service, etc.
Yeah, but actually, since you've mentioned that, his speech includes talking about preserving Britain's way of life, and he said, Keir Starmer, if that sounds Conservative, I don't care. So he wants to have a sort of continuum, if you like, to some extent. He doesn't want to rock the boat, a little bit like Tony Blair did in 1997. He kept the economic policies of the Tories and Ken Clarke.
Well, I think he's partly saying that it is not for the Conservatives, for example, to say that there's only one party that's patriotic. It's not for the Conservatives to say there's only one party that actually tackles these big challenges. So I didn't mind that at all. And what I liked about the speech was, one, it was actually quite thoughtful about the state of the world. But secondly, I think it's a strategic plank. He's setting a marker for what now comes between now and the election.
And do you agree with Alistair Campbell about putting distance and certainly putting the Corbyn era behind him and the Labour Party in order to stand a chance at the next election?
I don't think we should even... I don't think talking... It's not sensible for any leader to be constantly naming the previous leader, and we didn't win it. We didn't win it. I'd rather go back to where Alistair was, which is that the Conservative Party is not Conservative because it's trashing fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law. And if I support those things, does that make me Conservative? If so, I'm guilty. But we also need, to some extent, an economic reset, just as we had in 1945, after people put up with the privations of World War II. We lost twice as many civilians during COVID, and now the nurses can't feed themselves.
And have you heard that from Keir Starmer? Have you heard that radical transformation from Keir Starmer? I mean, Alistair Campbell just said we're not hearing the policy vision.
I know that there's always caution, you know, a certain amount of time before a general election because you're worried that the government will either steal your policies or trash them. But I think, you know, fairly soon, we don't know, of course, it's the Prime Minister that gets to call the timing of the election. Fairly soon, you know, both wings of the Labour Party that require the eagle to fly need to have a song in their heart. Well, and I do think we need a bit more of the vision thing.
Right. So in The Guardian, Keir Starmer, the headline, urged to unite with new generation of Labour's left. Do you agree with that? John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, is wanting Keir Starmer to try and bring in the Labour left and include them going forward, whether or not that means Jeremy Corbyn coming back into the party. He said no, of course, Keir Starmer, but should he?
Look, I'm sure that even John McDonnell would agree that he's not a new generation, and nor is Jeremy. What I think we need to be... One of the things that sort of keeps me here is that I do care about the next generation in politics generally, and I don't want them to be disillusioned, and an obvious place for them to go if they care about the planet and they care about greater equality and they care about rights and freedoms and they care about peace and security is the Labour Party. And everybody, young and old, are going to need a little bit more by way of vision and policy before the election. I'm sure that must come.
How much of a problem is it that Keir Starmer has dropped pretty well his entire leadership campaign, pledges and promises, whether it was on tuition fees, whether it's on nationalising public utilities, it's gone.
Well, look, the Conservatives will try very, very hard to make it a problem for him, for sure, because they're going to try and portray him as being untrustworthy. But I think what it signals to the public is his absolute determination to win and his absolute determination to get his way within the Labour Party. And I think people quite admire and respect that. And actually, I think the other thing I would say... But I agree with Shami, by the way, about, you know, there's no point comparing Keir with Corbyn or with Tony or with Gordon or with anybody else.
But as you say, it's taken a lot of time for Keir Starmer to actually deal with that.
Well, it hasn't really. If you think about it, Keir is trying to do in one term what it took previously Neil Kinnock, John Smith and Tony Blair to do over a very long period of time. So, and I also think on the policy agenda, look at we talked about Erdogan a minute ago. If he does win, I think one of the big things that's going to help him win is that just before the election, he made some massive announcements about public sector pay, as it happens. But I think it's sensible for Labour to... They know that they can't just promise money left, right and centre, but it's sensible for Labour not to push out the whole policy agenda so far from an election.
Danny?
Well, if Alistair thinks the public will be impressed with the fact that Keir Starmer has broken his word, completely abandoned the
No, I didn't
commitments.
say that.
Well, you said that they think they'd respect him for
No, I think this
tacking towards power, which is indeed exactly what he's doing. The problem is nobody knows what Keir Starmer stands for. I think it's rather pathetic for him to stand up and say how tough he's going to be on reform. He has to stress it himself. It's going to Clause 4 on steroids. The fact is he's not going to do any radical reform because, as Shami says, Alistair, from his speech, he's actually a Conservative. He's committed and he's in hock to the left, who will not allow him to do any substantial reforms.
I said. That's not what I said.
Okay, forgive me. Sorry.
Shami, I'll let you come and respond.
But the fact is, I think he is going to be Conservative with a small c on public service reform and on economic reform. Where I do agree with Shami.
And possibly socially, which you guys fear.
Well, he should. I'm pleased to hear him talking about reform. I'm pleased that Wes Streeting says the NHS needs to change. I'm pleased that he himself is recognising that the voters of the country want social conservative politics again. They don't want radical leftism.
Well,
I just don't believe he'll be able to do it.
Well, let Shami respond. You're shaking your head.
I said that if supporting the rule of law and the BBC makes you a Conservative, then suddenly I will be a Conservative. But what I think the voters of this country want is the ability to put food on the table when they're working so hard, to pay their rent and pay their mortgages. And it's the economy, stupid. And under this present government that's been in power for all these years, people are poorer and their children are set to be poorer. And that is pretty terrifying for a hell of a lot of people.
Henry?
So I think it was slightly wearying when you hear there's a certain mode of Labour way of talking about the Tory party, which is the Tory party's solemn duty to defend whatever it is that Labour did 5 minutes ago. So Labour come in 1997 and they do a huge amount of constitutional change, and that's all fine. And then the Conservatives get elected and say, actually, we don't like some of this, and suddenly they're not Conservatives anymore. But it was also slightly weird. Clause 4 on steroids. It's a bit of a zombie reference, right? Like, I mean, when Tony Blair was, taking over Labour in 1994, did he ever feel the urge to say the white heat of technology on steroids?
Not necessarily.
I think you've got a point. I think you've got a point.
And the other point I would make about that is that Clause 4, the reason that Clause 4 was so powerful is precisely because Clause 4 was a very specific commitment. It was a specific provision of the Labour Party constitution. Yeah. It was obviously freighted with symbolic meaning, but it was a real move. So saying Clause 4 on steroids and then attaching that to what is currently a very vague set of commitments.
That's why you have to deliver on that.
Is
Clause 4
problematic.
is about public ownership and about that long-standing commitment by the Labour Party.
It's still a very specific reference that political wants
but if you're talking
and the
about
public
political
don't,
symbolism and, as Henry said, what it means, do you agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I agree to some extent. And the point I make about Clause 4, it wasn't even the fact that it was about public ownership. It was signalling to the Labour Party that we have to show the country that we're going to change. That was what it was about.
But you then have to talk to the country.
Correct. We didn't go to the election saying, vote for us, we change Clause 4. We went to said, vote for us because we're going to change the economy, the health service,
there's an element of being stuck in the eternal present. It's just as tedious when the Conservative Party talk about the winter of discontent.
Correct.
It was a very long time ago. Why do we not have our own reference point?
But it was a line in a speech which I think he used to signal to the party, don't worry, bold change is coming, I think.
What would be the one thing you would like to hear Keir Starmer set out in terms of a policy platform now or very soon?
Well, I actually was genuinely quite excited. I hope it's true, this stuff about lowering the voting age, and I'd love them to...
Franchising the Europeans.
Well, and this too. Let's just show this headline, the Daily Mail, Starmer to use EU citizens to, as they call it, rig polls.
Well, you can't do that until you've won an election anyway. So I think that... Look, I love it when the Daily Mail get hysterical about anything that Labour says and does. But I think constitutional reform, which I'll be honest, I used to think back in the day was a bit of, chattering class thing. I think that the public are ready, not just for a change of government, but for a real change about how we do politics.
I think all the reforms you guys passed already have panned out really well over the last 20 years, haven't
Like what?
I mean, Scottish devolution, turbocharging the SNP.
Well, that's a consequence of it, but
but things have consequences. That's how we judge them.
Sure, but I still think it was right to have Scottish Parliament.
But no regrets at all.
Well, I regret
the Labour Party manifesto of 1997 said a sovereign Westminster Parliament will deliver devolved parliaments of Scotland and Wales. The threat of the union will be strengthened. The threat of separatism will be removed. Do you think that it did that?
No, I think, but I do think we delivered a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Assembly. I think that has been good for the overall.
That's kind of input-based. You managed to get the buildings up.
And 16 and 17-year-olds should definitely have the vote.
Well, do you think they should? I mean, this lowering of the voting age.
No, I wouldn't support that, and nor would I support enfranchising the European nationals. If they
You
want to vote
suppose
in the
you
UK, they
support
should come-
disinfranchising young people?
On the contrary, no, I do
If you
not.
let
Well, the vote
If
right
they want to vote in
Right,
the UK, and they'd be very welcome to come and get British citizenship. That's the way it works. You should not be enfranchising
But he
foreign
gets
nationals.
off the 16 and 17-year-olds because, of course, they are the future, and they are going to have to
Well, so are
deal.
the 14 and
But
13-year-olds.
I think the thing about the
No,
16
I know. I appreciate that it's always an arbitrary limit, but I think that but 16 is the right place. You
But
can
it's-
already work, you can already serve in the armed forces, you can already have sex, and they are going to be picking up the tab for climate catastrophe and so many other, really,
but
really
for how
big
long?
problems.
You can't drink until you're 18. You currently can't smoke until you're 18. That might go up. And soon you might not be able to drive a passenger until you're 25.
drinking
In
and
every
smoking-
other direction, it used to be that we prepared citizens for the franchise
Well, we need political
by letting
education
them do
alongside
stuff
it.
younger,
We need
and then they
political education
matured into the
alongside it.
vote. Now we seem to be proposing to let people vote before we give them an awful lot of the
They
responsibilities
already vote in
of adulthood.
Scotland. You'd say that's a terrible
I mean,
thing.
it does happen in some
Well, I-
elections.
One of the best
Policy.
things. One of the best things about the Scottish referendum campaign was, apart from the outcome, with 2014, was the fact that you'd be walking down the street in Glasgow or Edinburgh or Dundee or Aberdeen, anywhere, listening to young teenagers talking about politics in a way that
That's what a load of populist promises that won't get fulfilled will do for a politician.
Well, I don't agree. I think
The
it's been
nationalist
good for the
campaign was
debate.
based on invisible
Yes,
oil
but
fields.
I'm talking
I'm
about
sorry.
just giving
How can you
young
limit-
people. If you give those young people a real stake, at the moment they feel they're not engaged in politics.
But will
they're
they vote?
involved. Well, they'd vote more if they thought that actually it would have an impact.
Can I, just before we move on, what did you make of this story, though, Shami? Labour accused of plot to reverse Brexit by giving millions of European workers in UK
Fake
and
a
British teenagers, we'll
paranoia.
put that aside, the vote. Is that something you would back?
What, a plot to reverse?
Not the plot.
The
to
headline,
give-
the
to
plot,
give,
or
to
the...
give the EU citizens, to give EU citizens the vote. Come
I
on,
have to say,
don't deflect.
my priority would be the young people. But people who are based and work. It is not uncommon in democracies to
exactly.
have people who pay tax and live
Absolutely.
long term in a country to give them the franchise. So I don't feel as strongly
is
about it as
unusual
I do
for a
the young
national
people.
election.
But it's
It's very
not as
unusual.
scary as the Daily
You
Mail
look alarmed.
suggests.
I think it would be profoundly wrong. I mean,
Why?
part of me really hopes they don't do this because there is a small chance they'll win the election and then we'll have it. But I almost want them to campaign on it because it is so fundamentally wrong and the public will be so rightfully outraged at the suggestion that people who are not committed
It's
to
always
this country...
culture war with you.
Well,
It's always
this
culture
isn't
war
culture.
with
This
you.
isn't
culture
The
war. This is
idea-
about essential
the citizens-
democracy.
Don't talk over each other.
This
but
isn't. This isn't. I think you can just dismiss. There's an element of I advocate for positive cultural change. You indulge in a culture war about this. Citizenship defines the group of people with whom the state has its primary covenant. It's important. It's not symbolic. So we have an arrangement where people can come here and pay taxes and they get access to your
Except
local
the
government.
non-doms.
But letting people participate in the full extent of the democratic system without becoming
Look, I
citizens
don't have a strong
fundamentally
view- I don't have a
changes the
strong view on
franchise.
it.
And
I don't
we've
have a
discussed
strong view on
something
it.
that isn't as yet policy. We're going to move on. The BAFTAs last night, you may or may not have watched it, but Kate Winslet, the actress, had some very emotional words in her acceptance speech. Let's have a listen.
I Am Ruth was made for parents and their children, for families who feel that they are held hostage by the perils of the online world, for parents who wish they could still communicate with their teenagers but who no longer can, and for young people who have become addicted to social media and its darker sides. This does not need to be your life. To people in power and to people who can make change, please criminalise harmful content. Please eradicate harmful content. We don't want it. We want our children back.
What did you make of the speech? We'll talk about the online safety bill in a moment, but what did you make of that speech?
Well, I just seen it for the first time. I was very impressed. I mean, what a powerful statement. And I recognise everything she's saying. As the parent of children entering their teens, I'm extremely concerned about what the online world means for them. I think it's absolutely right that we think, as the government is doing, how do we ensure that the standards we expect of each other in the real world apply online as well? How do we extend the principles of a civilised and decent law-governed society to the internet? That's an enormous challenge, but the principle is absolutely right, and we do need essentially to rescue our society from technology. As we move forward, as we harvest all the benefits that tech brings, we have to remember who it's all about, which is human beings, and at the moment I don't think we're getting the balance right.
Shami?
So I agree with all of that, but it's a particular challenge, if I may say so, and if you have time to adjust your speech for this afternoon, it's a particular challenge for national Conservatives because, of course, big tech like climate catastrophe is international, it is global. And so you need ultimately international solutions to address this. These people are paying no tax. They are the new imperium. They fly under logos instead of flags. And we can argue about who's got the vote. They don't care who's got the vote. They are rich enough and big enough to buy and sell politicians and turn our deputy prime minister into their head of PR. And we've got to deal with this at an international level, at a treaty level, ultimately, whatever our squabbles here on this little island.
But in the meantime, do you recognise the distress there of Kate Winslet? You know, parents losing their children to social media, families being sort of ripped apart, really, by it.
I don't actually think it's just about children. I actually think a lot of politicians are completely addicted to social media and not in a good way. I actually think that you look back to the Brexit referendum, the role of Cambridge Analytica, it's all part of the same thing. I think the debate about artificial intelligence now, I think we're already moving into the next phase of this, which is, I find that genuinely quite terrifying, because and I think with social media, I completely agree with Shami. This is something where I write a lot in the book about Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, William Rees-Mogg, who wrote this incredible book back in 1997 called The Sovereign Individual. And it's all about how do the people of wealth and power get themselves even further out of the clutches of democratic and economic control set by others. And I think these guys, they call themselves anarcho-capitalists. People like Musk, they're trying to get away from any sort of democratic control.
It sounds slightly conspiratorial, right?
Well, they're very open about it.
Sure, but every conspiracist thinks the conspiracy is happening. That's what makes them a conspiracist.
But they admit it. I mean,
but they admit it. It's not a conspiracy, it's in plain view.
Peter Thiel is one man who is a comic book villain, I'll concede you that. But
William Rees-Mogg is a
idea,
very, very clever guy who wrote a book that I think is a Bible for these guys.
Lots of people, lots of clever men write books.
And lots of politicians are vulnerable to being courted, whether it is by media moguls like Murdoch or whether it is like AI. Everyone is vulnerable to that. In terms of how we protect our children, do you think it is a salient, as Kate Winslet is saying?
Look, I am somebody who is furious that Elon Musk has not killed Twitter yet, because I can't leave it, but I really do want to be free of it. So I think that the speech is good and it is important, and I think, you know, for me, I was in the generation that's kind of just about grew up before the internet and then had the internet, and I think that it would be completely different if I'd had access to a mobile phone from when I was 12 or whenever. Yeah. But ultimately, I think what that speech kind of missed is that the government can't do everything. The internet is fundamentally a relatively lawless place. You do need to just, as parents, restrict, take the phone away, don't buy them one. Be much more on it about how you do. No, I know. But
and they get alienated at school.
Yes, I know. Yeah, it's really hard, and this is a big cultural change. You'll have to band together with other parents, or run it through school. Run it through the school, right? Get the school to do it. But if you don't do that,
well, that's why he's Conservative Home. I mean, he's been very interesting. And by the way, I'm sorry for getting your name wrong earlier. You're right. There is a role for parents, but there is also a role for government and for governance. And I do think that this is like a new continent, and there will have to be a rule of law. It'll take a bit of time.
Then they're going to take it to space.
But in the end, we're going to. Yeah, they're so rich. They want to go off to space and leave us on the burning planet, having messed it up. So we have to take back control.
Is the government limited in what it can do then?
To a degree, yes, because we're talking about mobile global companies, as Shami says. I mean, that's not to say that the national governments can't, and I agree about the importance of doing things bilaterally or multilaterally through treaties. But fundamentally, governments can dictate what is practiced in their own jurisdiction, and they should absolutely be restricting, as we are doing through the Online Safety Bill.
Although it's taken so long.
Well, it's very difficult to get this right, but what we are doing is imposing criminal penalties on the directors of tech companies that put harmful content out. So it's not just some kind of corporate malfeasance. The people who are responsible for corrupting children should be responsible for it. So there's a very real-world plan that is possible to implement.
But it's not just children, is it? It's influencing elections. It's fake news to the point that you can
actually requires serious regulation. I do not dispute
greatly diminishing the reputations of professions such as barristers and academics.
Although,
well, I mean, not that. I mean, that's well, but
the bill was developed, wasn't it, in part in response after the suicide of Molly Russell. That was the sort of impetus for it, and yet we don't yet have it on the statute book. How far do you think a national government can go in terms of trying to either limit or criminalise the publishers of this stuff?
They can go so far, but they can go so far, but they can't do what's really required. And just as we had treaties in 1945, we need some new treaties to deal with this new continent. I think Alistair Mann mentioned AI. We need a right to a human decision about certain things that are very important to our lives.
Except the government's very keen, of course, to make the UK a centre for investment in AI.
Sure.
You wouldn't disagree with that?
No, not at all. But I think there has to be an understanding of what it's doing, because I think that even the people who define themselves as experts, I'm not sure they really understand where this thing's going.
Well, they've said
some of them are very alarmed. Some of them are very, very alarmed.
Henry?
Yeah, there are other things the government could do as well. So, for example, they could legislate to guarantee what's called user-to-user connection, which means that currently, if you sign up to something like TikTok or Twitter, you don't actually have a right to see the people that you've subscribed to and follow, because those will swap out for sponsored content that you haven't followed, and it undermines the system. So they could just say, if you're subscribed to someone, you're guaranteed to hear them. It would undermine the business model, but it would hinder promotion of fake news.
That's all we have time for from all of us here. Thank you to my guests. Bye-bye.